Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back from our short break. My name is Peter John Buchan. I'm the language instructor and the head of department for the Icelandic department at the University of Manitoba. And I just wanted to, before we jump into this next panel, I wanted to take a moment to thank, or to add my thank yous to the welcome statement that Andy gave us this morning. I really, over the years, these medieval and modern symposia have offered opportunities for many distinguished guests to visit us and present some of their research, and also have served as a wonderful vehicle for some of our students to present their research. So it really has been a wonderful recurring event for us within the Department of Icelandic and for the university in general. And I did want to take a moment to thank all of our presenters and all of our guests today, both the ones who'll be speaking and all of you who've taken the time to join us today for this symposium. And I know it's dangerous to thank people because you always forget someone. So I'm going to be a little bit general about this and simply thank the various staff members, students and instructors who've worked so hard over the last few weeks and especially today to make this event happen. And I think that the one person I want to name is Dustin, who is an absolute powerhouse and without whom these events wouldn't be happening. So I wanted to acknowledge his work. I'm very honored to be able to host this next, or to chair this next panel. We have two speakers, as you'll already know. We have Tom Shippey and Meghan Korten, who will be talking about some of their research. Tom Shippey is a medievalist, now retired, who specialized in Old English and Old Norse. More to the point, he has been a science fiction and fantasy fan since way, way back, and currently reviews both genres for the Wall Street Journal. Meghan Korten is a doctoral student, a doctoral candidate in the Department of History at the University of Iceland. Her doctoral project examines the intersections of gender, labor, and power in the production of homespun cloth on the medieval Icelandic farmsteads, and her wider interests include textile crafts and handiwork and the materiality of daily life. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom right away for his talk about the old gods' return. Please take it away, Tom.
Okay. Well, hope everybody can hear me. I only have 20 minutes to introduce a very large topic. So let me say straight off that my aim is to write a short book on the use of Old Norse myth in modern fantasy and science fiction. And the problem is that the topic has gone viral. Well, we understand gone viral these days. It means that it's all over the place. And if you actually contract it, you do not necessarily know where you got it from. And that is the case with Old Norse myth in modern fantasy and science fiction. I grew up with fantasy and SF beginning back in 1958, and my present role as reviewer of the two genres for the Wall Street Journal means that I get sent an awful lot of books in this area. So the lists I've circulated, one of original fiction using Old Norse myth and the other of retellings of Old Norse myth, they're more comprehensive than anything I've seen on the internet. But because it's gone viral, no one person can read everything. And that's why I've circulated my lists. If you know something I've missed out, please tell me. My email is shippey@slu.edu, SLU for St. Louis University, and I'd be happy to learn of any new ones. That said, there are two questions I need to address. One is, what has made Old Norse myth so popular in the modern world? And the other is, what are the main ways in which authors have chosen to handle it? Well, that first question was answered by Ursula Le Guin so well that I'll just quote it here. She said in a review of Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology, quote, "Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are divine comedies. There may be punishment for the wicked, but the promise of salvation holds. What we have from the Norse is a fragment of a divine tragedy." I would actually go further than that, but time presses, so let me quote also A.S. Byatt. Her book Ragnarok begins with a personal memoir in which she calls herself the Thin Child and tells us how she came across Norse myth in a book by Wilhelm Wegener, which had The Wild Hunt on its cover. It's typical, by the way, that modern authors remember very well the books they read as children, but because their memories are child memories, they don't know exactly what the books were. Wegener wrote several books on myth, but which one Miss Byatt or Miss Wynne Jones picked up is not so certain. And again, authors mention books which I've never had the chance to see. Well, nevertheless, to Miss Byatt, born in 1936 and a wartime evacuee, The Wild Hunt on the cover of her book made perfect sense. She'd heard the roaring of propellers in the sky. She heard the bangs and saw the flashes of the bombs on Sheffield and on the airfield nearby. She cowered under the stairs as people were taught to cower when the Wild Hunt passed by. Her world was full of fear. Meanwhile, in Sunday school, she was told about gentle Jesus and shown pictures of Jesus preaching, quote again, to a congregation of attentive, cuddly animals, rabbits, a fawn, a squirrel, a magpie. The thin child, Miss Byatt writes, tried to respond to the picture and failed. For her, and no doubt others, the Norse mythology was real and relevant. Gentle Jesus, meek and mild, as preached by the Church of England at any rate. I was brought up Kirk of Scotland, which is not very big on cuddly animals. But anyway, gentle Jesus, meek and mild, didn't mean a thing. There's another factor. Why do you think Game of Thrones on the TV has been so popular? It's not the plot lines, it's the characters. There's Tyrion, the clever dwarf. There's Daenerys, the mother of dragons. There's Arya, the faceless assassin. There's Cersei, the incestuous politician. Apart from Jon Snow, the one straight arrow, they're all interestingly ambiguous, morally ambiguous. Now, in a way, the central figures of Old Norse myth can be identified with the standard American high school stereotypes. Thor is the dumb jock. Loki is the clever, unpopular nerd. It's no wonder why the jock and the nerd don't get on. But Odin is inscrutable. Loki is, of course, deeply ambiguous, as is the whole relationship between gods and giants. And all these uncertainties present opportunities for reinterpretation. And the stories handed down in the prose and poetic Eddas, few as they are full of gaps. Well, if there's one thing a modern fantasy author likes more than another, it's finding a gap in an ancient and familiar tale and writing into it. So, going back to one of the earliest and most influential fantasy rewrites, The Roaring Trumpet by Sprague de Camp and Fletcher Pratt, have we ever asked ourselves, apropos of the famous visit to Utgarda-Loki by Thor, Loki and Thjalfi, what did they make the visit for? Well, said de Camp and Pratt, it must have been to recover Thor's stolen hammer, as in Thrumskvida. And furthermore, the giants already had Frey's famous sword, which fights by itself, 2 of the 3 great weapons, the third being Odin's Gungnir. What are they collecting these for? Well, they're making ready for Ragnarok, aren't they? Which gives Harold Shea, the American academic, flung into this impossible situation, both a role and a chance to redeem himself. Going on from there, and still thinking about gaps, who stole the hammer anyway? Well, that provides a chunk of the plot for Diana Wynne Jones's 8 Days of Luke. It was, of course, Loki, i.e. Luke, even if this contradicts his role with Utgarda-Loki, and that raises the question, why did he steal it? And now we're into Joanne Harris's The Gospel of Loki, where the enmity of Thor and Loki is explained and related to Loki's very suspicious snipping of Thor's wife's Sif's hair. Not motivated in the Prose Edda account, but one might well see it as a token of sexual conquest, which would give us a motivation right there. So, read the stories, look for the gaps, fill in the gaps, develop the characters, and reconcile the ambiguities. That's one strategy, which depends on careful rereading and, shall we say, interrogation of the prose Edda stories. There's another strategy, which is, so to speak, to turn the stories on their heads. Johan Harris's The Gospel of Loki starts off with a quote from Völuspá 2, but then it says, and this is Loki himself talking, so once again, quote, "Okay, stop right there. That was the authorized version, the prophecy of the oracle as told to Odin Allfather. Well, this isn't the authorized version. This is my version of events." And what follows is effectively the stories about Loki organized into a continuous narrative, but presented from his contrarian point of view. Part of this, of course, includes the begetting of the three monsters, Fenrir the wolf, Jörmungandr the great serpent, and Hel, goddess of death, on the giantess Angerboda, a relationship which Miss Harris presents in the tones of a modern domestic row or divorce court. After the incident with Tyr and his hand in the wolf's mouth, Angerboda screams at Loki, "I let you have our son for the weekend, and before I know it, he's chained up underground." Well, the evident next stage is to tell the whole story from the point of view of Angerboda, which is what A.S. Byatt did in Ragnarok. Only there, she focused on only one of the monsters, Jörmungandr. This was taken on a stage further, if not a stage and a half, in Genevieve Gornicek's The Witch's Heart, which has only just come out. In this, Ms. Gornicek identifies Angerboda with the mysterious figure of Gullveig, mentioned only in Völuspá 21:22, where she is said to be the one who woke war between Aesir and Vanir, to have been burned 3 times and reborn 3 times, to be the mistress of Seidr magic, and, quote, always a delight to wicked women. Well, a bad write-up like this is a natural provocation to rewriting, and Ms. Gornicek presents her composite figure, Gullveig Angerboda, as a challenge, not just to the establishment, like Loki, but to the whole patriarchy. Her friends are the goddess Skadi and the giantess Gerðr, both with their own grudge against the patriarchal gods. Skadi, because of the way she was cheated out of compensation for her father, Gerðr, because of her forced marriage to Freyr. It's the feminist take on Old Norse mythology. Well, one fictional strategy, pick out the gaps and the contradictions, like De Camp and Pratt. Another one, invert the moral polarities, like Miss Harris and Miss Gornicek. I'd add that I've only just obtained another inversion strategy story, which is Francesca Simon's The Monstrous Child. And this is the mythical story as told by Hel, the teenage goddess of death. New examples turn up all the time. Meanwhile, there's another way of analyzing fictional strategies, which is put forward by Farah Mendelssohn in her book Rhetorics of Fantasy. And Farah says, very, very truly, that there are 3 kinds of fantasy. One, there's portal fantasies, where a modern person is taken into a fantasy world. And the obvious example is C.S. Lewis's Narnia books. You know, you push open the back of a wardrobe, you're in Narnia. Another one, another kind of fantasy are immersive fantasies, where the reader is just placed in a fantasy world. And the obvious example of that is, say, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And then there's intrusive fantasies, where the creatures of fantasy turn up in our world. So portal, move to the other world. Immersion, you're in the other world. Intrusive, the other world comes into our world. On the whole, early mythical fantasies opted for the portal strategy, like De Camp and Pratt. A modern American finds himself included on the trip to Utgarðarloki. Other examples include Edmund Hamilton's early A Yank at Valhalla. Well, that's pretty self-evident from the title. Or later on, Tom Holt's Valhalla, where a young woman who is described as, quote, an uppity cocktail waitress, finds herself recruited to be a Valkyrie. one of whose duties is, of course, serving mead to the Einherjar in Valhalla. Pretty much like being a modern cocktail waitress, or so I'm told, in that you're serving strong drink to uncouth men with wandering hands. Mr. Holt's heroine, however, knows how to deal with them, and she sets about cleaning the place up. And if Odin doesn't like some nice embroidered covers on his throne of bones, well, he'd better get used to them. The comedy in these portal stories, you notice, and they are overwhelmingly comic, depends on anachronism, on clash of cultural styles. Among the immersive fantasies, which are just set in a different world, are Miss Harris's two books, Rune Marks and Rune Lights, where the old gods appear in a rather science-fictional, post-apocalyptic setting, and also immersive fantasies are all the monster-centered stories which I've just mentioned. But what about intrusive fantasies, where the gods appear in modern America? One sequence of these comes from Jim Butcher, which centers on Harry Dresden, a practicing witch in modern Chicago, forever dealing in a kind of Ghostbusters way with vampires and zombies, pixies and trolls, and other nuisances. This sequence has a more Christian element than most of these fantasies, C.S. Lewis's apart, but the Norse gods start to make an appearance in Butcher's Small Favor and then changes. As Professor Eldevik of University of Oklahoma notes, the first sign of this is a young woman called Sigrun, whom we soon identify as a Valkyrie. Now, okay, Valkyries in Chicago. What would Odin be in the modern world? Well, clearly he'd be a corporate CEO, chief executive officer, with employees who can be hired out as guards and mercenaries, all working for Monarch Securities. Monarch, of course, meaning one eye. Its records, the company's records, are kept by two black-haired, sharp-faced women whom one can again identify as avatars of Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, while Odin's pseudonym is Donar Vadarung, which Butcher translates quite wrongly as Father of Thunders. The best-known intrusive fantasy of this kind is, however, Neil Gaiman's American Gods. Its premise is that immigrants to America have brought their own gods with them, Norse, Slavic, ancient Egyptian, all of them finding employment as undertakers or slaughterhouse workers. I couldn't possibly get round to explaining the complex plot of this, but the problem for Mr. Wednesday, you can guess who he is to retain belief and worshippers in competition with the real gods of modern America, such as the goddess Media, who at one point offers the protagonist Shadow fame and wealth if he will only change sides, which he doesn't. The ending is, well, I'm not going to tell you about it, but it is strikingly macabre. One other narrative strategy is to simply retell ancient stories in a modern or futuristic setting, as Melvin Burgess does with the saga of the Volsungs, and as Poul Anderson did with the saga of Hrolf Kraki, or his book, The War of the Gods, which very ambitiously retells Saxo Grammaticus' story of Hadding, identified by Dumézil, as Anderson well knows, with the god Njörður. Anderson was actually thinking of retelling in the same way the Hrafnisdumana Saga, as I know because I gave him a translation of them, which we prepared collectively at Leeds University. But Poul died before he could start on the project. I have only one final comment to make, which is this. All these variant narrative strategies rely on cultural contrast, modern versus archaic, done comically or in a more macabre fashion, as in American Gods. But such contrasts all rely on an audience which is fairly well briefed on mythical story and capable of recognizing allusions, like Donar Vadarung's Raven secretaries or his Valkyrie and Einherjar employees. When the mysterious Luke turns up in Diana Wynne-Jones's 8 Days of Luke, the stitch marks round his lips indicate who he is to anyone who knows of the punishment inflicted on Loki. In brief then, Norse myth in the modern world has, as I said at the start, gone viral. It can turn up anywhere, and it does. Nor is there any easily traceable chain of transmission. It has become part of the modern world's critical furniture, to an extent, I believe, not well recognized in academia. It should get more attention from us. And I repeat, I'd be very happy to come across more examples. No one can read everything, not with 700 volumes of fantasy being published every year in the USA, or so they tell me. I didn't know about Jim Butcher till Professor Eldivik of Oklahoma told me, and I didn't know about Melvin Burgess till Professor Larrington of Oxford told me. So any additions to my list would accordingly be most welcome. And I see one has been sent in already, which is, of course, Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee at King Arthur's Court, which is a rather, I would say, rather primitive portal fantasy. But it's the same kind of thing. And of course, when I came across Edmund Hamilton's title, A Yank at Valhalla, I thought it was going to be the same kind of thing, but it wasn't quite. The authors, I should also say, are all trying to distinguish themselves from each other. They're all looking for original ideas, and they're all, in a way, in competition. So actually, there is a lot of interaction between the authors, some of which I could actually indicate in more detail. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. That's what I have to say, and I repeat, any more information you've got would be most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. I really appreciate that. I know, as Andy said, I'm sure there's a virtual round of applause echoing through Zoom right now for you. But we're going to move on right away to Meghan and have her.
Could I just say one thing?
Sure.
Kenzie's just put my email address up as tom.shippey@slewedu, but it isn't. It's just shippey@slewedu. So that's the address to send things to. Okay, thanks.
You bet. Thank you very much for correcting that. So we're going to move on to Meghan's presentation now. And just to remind everyone, there will be an opportunity for questions after she's done with her presentation. And when we get to that point, you can either unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can also ask the question in chat or raise your hand. We'll catch you and make sure you get a chance to ask your questions. So Meghan is going to give us a presentation today entitled Old Norse Women, Feminism and Textiles, the Post-Medieval Representation of Traditional Femininity. So please take it away, Meghan.
Thank you. I'm just going to set up my screen for a second. Okay, can everyone see this?
Yep, I can.
Okay, thank you, PJ, for chairing, and Dustin and everyone from the Icelandic department for organizing this and all the work behind the scenes to bring this symposium alive in this weird COVID life. Also to my fellow presenters and the audience for joining us today. So this presentation comes from questions I have as a historian studying women in the medieval period of why modern popular culture and media have a fascination with representing women from the early medieval period with the image of the strong, violent, and even sexy Viking warrior woman. Further and more important question is why don't we see more images of traditional women and their activities in our representations of Old Norse literature and popular culture? Even two very recent academic publications on Viking and Norse-Atlantic women use the term Valkyrie in the title, even though both books discuss much more diverse experiences of women. So there's no one image of the medieval woman, but rather medieval sources show complex and varied experiences for women and roles that can be considered more traditional for women, such as brewers, textile workers, mothers, wives, queens, who advise their sons and husbands, prostitutes, concubines, and mistresses. So how can we include these voices as well? Additionally, how can we create stories that are more inclusive and representative of experiences of women in the past in our medieval-based fantasies and popular culture? Here, I propose using textiles to look for women's stories and voices. Just as literature tells stories, textiles tell their own stories through visual iconography and ideology, but also tell about culture, society, relationships between people, through the materials chosen, methods and technologies used, the use of the textile itself, and most importantly, it tells about the people who made them. Including images of women in more traditional roles in our medievalisms and pop culture stories allows us to include women's voices and stories, and so represent more authentically the varied experiences of women in the past. So for this presentation, first we'll look at how Old Norse women are portrayed in popular culture. Then we'll move to look for evidence of the woman warrior in Old Norse or medieval sources. Next, we will look at some more traditional images of women in the medieval period, using textiles of woven cloth and embroideries to see images of women acting in more traditional roles. And then finally, we will look at how we can incorporate traditional images and roles when we tell stories about women in popular culture and society more generally. The image of the Viking warrior woman is popular in various media of popular culture. There are other female characters included, like mothers and wives, but they largely have minor roles or are non-player characters, and in general with less influence on the plot and action, or their main function is as a love interest. These media valorize the strong female, or anti-traditional female character, and fetishizes the female warrior. In comics, the most prominent would be the Thor comics, which include several female characters like Sif, Valkyrie, Huntress, Carnila, but also the female incarnation of Thor. There are also many warrior women in video games based on Old Norse mythology or other medieval-type fantasy worlds, and these include female or Valkyrie-type warriors. Some examples include God of War, with Freya as the former queen of the Valkyries, and where Valkyries appear as optional boss battles. Or also Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which has the option to play the protagonist Eivor as either male or female. Movies and TV shows are probably the most visible, with broad audiences and receptions with the growth of streaming platforms like Netflix that offer foreign programming and subtitles. Vikings and Norsemen are perhaps the most known and set in a Viking world, but there are others like Game of Thrones and The Witcher, which are set in medieval-type fantasy worlds, and others that are adapted to modern settings like Ragnarok or American Gods. Vikings is heavy on drama and violence and displays stereotypes of the Viking age with physically strong, violent, and raiding women warriors and shield maidens like Lagertha, Gunhildr, and Thorun, but also other women use sex and their physicality to create alliances with leaders and rulers, such as Siggy. This show has been hailed as feminist because of its depiction of many powerful female leads that challenge conventional ideas of women. On the other hand, Norsemen is more of a satire or comedy, but yet it still shows comparison of women and reflects modern conceptions of the medieval, with complex and contrasting characters that show how women could have navigated their society. There's Liv, the farmer's wife turned chieftain's wife, who's power-hungry and strategic. We have Hildur as the matronly and more traditional wife, who uses her husband's status and her pregnancy to keep her status, and Freyja as the raiding warrior woman. Conversely, we have Orm, who is shown knitting or some sort of textile craft, but this signals that he is the anti-Viking, sensitive, queer, loves arts and cultures instead of raiding and violence. From Game of Thrones, I want to specifically highlight how they portray the characters Arya and Sansa. From the beginning of the TV series, these two sisters are presented as opposites, contrasting two possible images of girlhood, and we see them grow up in two very different directions. In one of their first scenes, these two sisters are shown doing embroidery work. Sansa is presented as the feminine ideal, a maidenly figure who enjoys her embroidery and excels in skills of womanly virtue, while Arya, on the other hand, considers this boring and is bad at it, and she would be rather training in the more masculine activities of archery and swordplay with her brothers. Because this scene involves embroidery, and through Sansa and Arya's different attitudes toward it, we as an audience know that their lives are about to diverge into two very different paths. We are set up from the beginning against Sansa's character, whereas Arya is considered special and not like other girls. This dominant image of the woman warrior reflects modern concerns about equal rights, representation, and the desire to see more women on screens or paper. However, these are women acting like men, showing that they can do whatever men can do. While these free and enlightened characters get to travel, raid, and act violently towards act violently like men. This is done by generally denigrating women who stay within the boxes of more traditional roles of domestic life and mothering. So my question is, how representative is the woman warrior of women in the past? There are images of women warriors in the archaeological record, and these images have been interpreted as depictions of Valkyries, goddesses like Freya, and other mythological women from the legendary sagas. The legendary sagas offer examples of women breaking out of traditional roles and acting like Valkyries, shield maidens, and maiden kings, but there are rules or conventions for them, as there is generally a reason why they have to take up arms, and they return to the female sphere by the end of the story, either by their choice or others. In Volsunga Saga, Brynhildr is a Valkyrie or shield maiden who fights as a warrior and wears masculine war clothing, but later marries and takes on a more traditional female role, and this is signaled with her description as, quote, more skilled in the domestic arts than any other woman, end quote. And she embroiders a tapestry telling the deeds of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. A second example is from the Saga of Hezarth the Wise, which offers a similar legendary story with her as a shield maiden who retrieves the sword's turfing from her father's grave mound. She is described as being as strong as a man, trained in weaponry rather than textile work, and went roving with Vikings. But when she had enough of this life, she settled down to work with her hands in a more gender-appropriate domestic realm. These are just two examples of many warrior women in the legendary tales, but were there examples of women warriors in real life? Recently, the remains in Birka 581 chamber grave were re-examined. When excavated in the late 19th century, the remains were sexed as male due to the presence of weapon and other masculine-type grave goods. But genetic testing in 2017 has revealed that the occupant was actually sexed female, and this has been suggested that this represents a female military commander based on the high-status grave goods. This is a complicated case, and I'm not going to comment on how this person may have acted or presented their identity in the past, but I just want to highlight that there is this and other examples of graves that have female sex skeletons buried with traditionally male goods and weapons. So were there warrior women? I think it's unclear, but it's possible. But it's hard to say how much the stories reflect reality. I'd like to use the Valkyries in the poem Darathar Liod as a transition in our discussion of textile work, as it offers an interesting conflation of the violence, blood, and death connected to the Battle of Clontarf with a very traditional women's activity, weaving. This was an activity that occupied much of women's time before the modern period of factory production. This poem uses the image of Valkyries weaving to describe the death and destruction on the battlefield, but also describes a loom literally made up of body parts. And the violent actions of these women are tempered by the domestic nature of these feminine tasks. There are various other images of women that can be found in Old Norse sources, including roles in magic, dispensing wisdom and prophecies, roles in mothering and raising their children to uphold certain cultural values, fostering, and in general work activities like food preparation. But here I want to focus especially on women's role in textile work because it remains visible in the sources and is something that is still practiced by women and others today. Textiles tell women's stories in a time when they couldn't write their own stories and function in similar ways to poetry and prose in that they tell of cultural beliefs and customs. As material culture, textiles represent female makers and allow room for women's voices more generally through their daily life and work with surviving pieces of woven textiles and embroidery. First, I'm going to highlight an example from my own thesis project. So on every farmstead in medieval Iceland, plain woolen homespun cloth was woven by women. But specific units of this cloth was also used as currency, replacing silver as the main form of money in the medieval period. This cloth would be used to pay dowries, used in blood feud compensations, to buy things in general, and was traded abroad. In this case, women's weaving was the literal production of wealth. Weaving required specific knowledge and skills, and the final product had to be planned before even starting the project. This production was controlled within the household by the housewife, a powerful role as she controlled how much raw materials were to be used and the labor of the dependents in her household. In a more visual sense, women's work in textiles was also used for decoration and display of images of religious iconography and scenes of daily life. But this was also a means to tell stories, and their making required skills, knowledge, and planning. In Norway, the 9th century Asgard ship burial of 2 high-status women includes fragments of tapestries which show images of mythology and funeral customs. But the burial also includes textile tools and a loom, which tells us of the technology used to produce these beautiful textiles. This tapestry represents women's work, which is rife with images of humans, animals, and others representing mythological characters. But it also reflects the rituals of real life, like funerals. Another example is the Överhogdal tapestries of Sweden, dating between the 9th to 12th century, and they offer similar example of textiles that includes images of people, animals, trees, ships, and both legendary and religious figures, and has been variantly interpreted to represent Christianization, events from a Volsunga saga, or Ragnarok. Tapestries and textiles tell stories just as literature does. Another example is medieval altar frontals. Producing tapestries and embroidering large textiles intended for both religious and secular display was a typical activity for upper-class households across medieval Europe, and Iceland was no different. These textiles reveal technological practices and design techniques, but also cultural contact, as motifs and designs can be traced through cultures and across time periods. However, embroideries only survive in Iceland from the late medieval period onwards. Women's textile work on embroideries such as altar frontals tell stories of religious ideology with images of people that were important to the Icelandic religious community and would be displayed and seen by all who attended service. On the left is an example of an altar frontal from Draflastíðir in North Iceland from the mid-16th century. It displays images of the Virgin and Child and various apostles and both male and female saints and 2 Icelandic bishops, in addition to floral and decorative motifs in the borders in between the cells. And this was all done in laden couch stitch, known in Icelandic as reifilsamur. On the right is a pre-Reformation altar frontal that is thought to be from Stykkishólmur and includes the invocation to the Virgin Mary, Ave Maria, and features an interlaced knot design and was done in pattern darning stitch and long-armed cross-stitch. Women continued to produce textiles for display after the medieval period. I'm including these 2 post-medieval examples to show how we can see real people and dates on textiles, with identifiable people embroidered onto these textiles. On the left, we have Ragnhildur Jónsdóttir named on the 17th century altar frontal, and on the right, we have Olaf Jónsdóttir and her husband Erlendur Arnason on the 19th century coverlet, with their initials on the bottom right-hand corner of the enlarged picture. So as shown with these few examples, textiles demonstrate the rich cultural tradition and stories that medieval women could tell through their work. In The Subversive Stitch, Parker discusses a stereotype of femininity, which is seen as mindless, decorative, delicate, and present in order to signal taste and status, but lacks any significant content. This idea has pervaded into our popular culture and medievalisms that portray the feminine as boring, if it is even included, especially embroidery. And it also uses tropes that pit women against each other in traditional versus non-traditional roles, so that they have to choose one identity or the other. But I would argue that textile work and embroidery are not boring. They can tell beautiful stories and reveal important and powerful roles played by women in the past. So concerning the popularity of women warriors, we've answered the why. It's interesting, fun, and exploration. The how accurate, that's unclear. And we've also looked at some examples of textiles that show women's work and stories. But now we have to answer the how can we offer more inclusive and authentic representations of Old Norse or medieval women in our comic books, TV shows, and movies. I am offering 4 methods. The first, don't pit women characters against each other in masculine versus feminine type roles. Second, have female characters for having female characters, not as appendages to men or to serve the plot of male characters. Balance the image of the sexy warrior woman with strong women characters who act in more traditional female roles and activities, or allow them to do both. Third, prioritize the female gaze over the male gaze. Characters don't need to act like men in order to be strong and valued. And finally, more representation of traditional female activity. And if you include women's work, do it in a positive light. These various representations of medieval or medieval-type women represent a desire to include women and see ourselves in the past. And this is great. Let's look at a few examples of doing this. Game of Thrones, I feel, gets some things wrong, but other things right. The costume designer Michelle Carriger has used embroidered images of dragon skin, lions, bugs, flowers, or fish to signal identity and personal, family, and geographical alliances. This looks beautiful, but also serves a purpose for the narrative. And one would assume that the high-status women would be producing their own clothes. Another example is with the Bio Tapestry, which has inspired several modern retellings of stories through embroidery and using the same laden couch stitch that was used in the medieval period. And on a side note, you can now see the entirety of the Bio Tapestry online. For Game of Thrones, HBO partnered with Tourism Ireland to create an alternate visualization of the Game of Thrones story and is now displayed in Ulster Museum for visitors to see, but it was also used in the documentary on the making of the stories. The Icelandic Saga Center in Kvölsvöllur has completed a 91-meter-long retelling of Njál Saga and allowed visitors to contribute to the project, gaining both knowledge of the story, but also a hands-on experience of how the rifle stitch was done. So my final question is historical accuracy important in popular culture representations of female women? Does there need to have been real women warriors? I would say no. This is a great space for us in modern times to explore our own identities and just have fun with the past. Most of these women characters are not presented as history, but fantasy, and there's room for play. And there are other things that aren't real, like dragons and zombies. Accuracy, I feel, is less important than combating the enduring stereotypes and hypermasculinity that these images push, fetishizing the female warrior. And the problem is that it remains the main image that we have for medievalisms on the lives of women in the early medieval period. What is important is having a balanced representation that does not present women as boring or belittles the experiences of women in the past. Excluding women's stories and voices for the sake of representation by means of women who act like men isn't good enough. The past was different and unequal, but not telling their stories re-exploits them. So in conclusion, why is it so important to tell women's stories? Men are already the dominant culture in our society, so they have wider and more varied depiction in popular culture, and their stories are treated with more care. Stories by and for men are seen as relevant and given weight. Women commonly consume both men and women's stories, and so women writers can more authentically display both men and women's stories because they see both. But it is important to have men, and especially young boys, see women's stories and experiences so that writers can be inclusive of women, but also more accurately represent their experiences while avoiding disparaging women in the past. This can be difficult, but by highlighting women's own experiences, and not just women who act like men, is a chance for a broader and more inclusive understanding of people's experiences in the past and interpretations for the present. On a final note, textiles and crafts continue to tell women's stories today with visual displays of culture and personal identity, but also of political and social issues with subversive and non-mainstream comments on current events and also the experience of being a woman in today's society. And in this, we have a rapport with our sisters in the medieval period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Megan. That's really appreciate your presentation as well. That was very, very interesting. We certainly have time for some questions. We have about 25 minutes that we can use for questions. So I thought I would just open it up if you have any questions for either Tom or Meghan. Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask? Or anything you'd like? So just whether it's about Tom's talk about the old gods return and the use of Old Norse myth in some novels through the 20th century and 21st centuries, or about Meghan's talk that she just gave us about textiles and the representations of women in modern fantasy. I see there's a question or a suggestion in the chat from Caitlin Parsons about the Dvergen fra Normandiet, or in Icelandic Dvergurinn fra Normandi. Production of the Bio Tapestry is central to the novel, although the book itself doesn't tell women's stories in the sense that you're advocating. Is that a book that you're familiar with at all, Meghan? Have you seen that one?
No, I haven't. So thank you. I will look into that.
Excellent. Yeah. And I know, Tom, you might have noted that earlier, Caitlin put in the chat as well a comment about Emil Hjörvar Petersen's books, his series of books called Saga Eftirlifenda, or the Saga of the Survivors, which is also sort of it's an Icelandic book. I don't believe it's available in English, but is a fantasy novel that sort of I think it fits into your immersive fantasy style, where it posits the idea that after Ragnarok, the world has begun again, and the gods who survive Ragnarok are now sort of in some kind of a conflict, but includes some of the things you talked about with the story about Odin as the CEO of a large company. I believe in this one, it's one of Odin's sons who runs a company out of Gimli, Manitoba, if I remember correctly. And serves as the primary sort of evil character in the story. And yes, absolutely, as Caitlin puts in, it could also be classified as an intrusive fantasy. So are there any questions from the participants or from our guests that they want to ask?
I have one.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah. Tom, because you mentioned Neil Gaiman's American Gods, and he has also recently published a retelling of the Old Norse myths that is also on your list. Do you see any, like, do they influence each other? Does his work in American Gods influence his retelling of the myths, which I haven't read, I must admit? I think you're muted.
Okay.
Yes, now we can hear you.
Right. Oh, sorry. Arman, I didn't hear that very well. Could you tell me again?
Do you think Neil Gaiman's work in American Gods influences his retelling of the Old Norse myth that is also on your list? I haven't really read it yet, but is it like, does it pervade his retellings? No.
Yeah. Well, one of the problems is that I've been concentrating on print fiction, but there's also, of course, the American Gods TV series. There's the Thor films from Marvel Comics. There's a whole literature of graphic novels. Some time ago, I was asked to write a short précis of this topic, covering all of these. And I said, I couldn't possibly do it. What affected me quite considerably was that I knew that Marvel Comics had produced 600 issues of their comic Thor, and I'd never even seen one of them. And I wasn't going to start either. So what I know about that comes from Professor Eldavik in Oklahoma, because she grew up reading them. And in a way, the only way you can keep up with the comics and the graphic novels and so on, I think, is if you started when you were about 14. Catching up with it all now is not possible. And the ramifications of it all I think again, how many people have seen the American Gods TV series? Millions and millions. And what effect has it had on them? I have no idea. So really, one can only pick out small areas, but I realize that there are very large areas all around my small area, which are completely unknown to me. And like I say, one thing which is quite interesting is who started all this? What were the, the first spreaders, the first communicators of Old Norse myth? One of them, I think I've got here. I think this was very influential. Oh, sorry. No, that's right. I haven't got it upside down. These are the Kiri sisters who wrote the Heroes of Asgard. I think it was in 1857. This was obviously a kind of children's classic. And I don't know how many people read it. And as I was saying, even when the authors tell you what they read when they were young, they don't actually know what it was. So I think much of this is actually kind of insoluble. Well, but you can pick away at bits of it, and you can get a general picture. But the details, I'm afraid, I think I could once have known more about this, because one of the early producers of it was my old friend Harry Harrison, who wrote The Web of the Norns. Now, if I'd asked Harry, Harry, you knew De Camp, you knew Lester Del Rey, I know you hated him, but all right, you knew him. What were you all reading back in the 1940s? And Harry would have told me. But he died a few years ago, and I didn't know to ask him. And now I think that knowledge is probably irrecoverable. Many mysteries. Yeah, go on.
For Alman and Tom, there's a wonderfully interesting article by Jon-Katle Helgason, who's written about the Marvel Thor comics, in which he points out that many of the writers and illustrators in that series, particularly around the middle of the 20th century, were actually Jewish, and that a lot of the themes of bizarrely, a lot of the themes of the Thor comics are about Thor bashing Hitler, which is exactly what you wouldn't expect. And I've argued in a little article that Neil Gaiman's American Gods is actually the politics of it is very interesting, because it's arguing that, as it were, no one is American. Everybody's an immigrant. Even going back to what we thought of as the First Nation peoples. So the kind of politics of it is extraordinarily interesting, I think.
Yes, actually, my old pal Harry Harrison was also Jewish, and yes. Again, often pointed this kind of thing out to me. Again, I should have asked him more than I did.
And of course, the American Gods on Screen series, which I'm sorry to say I have spent many hours watching. I think Baldur is mixed race there, in spite of being the fairest of the whitest of all gods. He's mixed race.
Yes, I have Jon-Katle Helgason's book, actually, so I'll try and get some more out of that. But going back to a Connecticut Yankee, Sprague de Camp's most famous work was a portal fantasy called Lest Darkness Fall. And I once wrote an article in which I said this was clearly a kind of reprise of a Connecticut Yankee. And Sprague de Camp wrote to me and said, no, it wasn't. He said it was actually provoked by a very inferior reprise of Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee, which is published as a serial in Astounding Science Fiction. But I've never been able to find it. So that's another kind of thread which led me nowhere, and there are so many of them. But there was clearly a kind of writers' collective back in the 1940s or 50s in New York, authors who knew each other well and, basically traded ideas with each other. And I think that's still going on. Peter Buchan says, there's the Heorot series, which retells the Beowulf story. And of course, if you looked at Beowulf versions, you would also see the story as told from the monster's point of view, like John Gardner's Grendel, which in a way perhaps started the whole series off.
Yes, there's quite a lively discussion going on in the chat about some of the various retellings of Norse myth, the Gunnlaðar saga by Svava Jakobsdóttir, and some stories. Yeah, so there's quite a few in there as well that you might be able to.
Yeah, I'm writing them down as fast as I can. And I've got some. I've copied some to print out later. Let's just see. Yes, okay. 3 Hearts and 3 Lions, another interesting case. And I can't remember whether that was a portal fantasy or an intrusive fantasy. But yes, Poul Anderson, actually, I should say, like Harry Harrison, Poul was a Danish American. He actually spoke Danish, and he was quite capable of reading Old Norse. And I wouldn't like to say what he read or what he didn't read. And the same goes for Harry, who was extraordinarily well read in a kind of limited area. So once again, the question of what their sources were is not at all easy to make out. I was very impressed by Poul Anderson. He thought of everything I'd thought of before I thought of it. And I'm sorry that he didn't finish his project of Hrafnistamana Saga as retold. Okay, I'm just skimming down the chats to see if there's anything else I could pick up. Yes. Michael McPherson mentions H. Beam Piper's Space Viking, which hasn't got any myth in it, I don't think. It has the Viking image. And if we are going to dive into mid-century serialized SF pulp, yeah, I'm there already. I dived into it in 1958 and I've never come out. So that's fine by me. But there's a question from Meghan, which I've just noticed. Yeah.
Yes. So the question for Meghan is whether she's noticed any change in the portrayal of women in the past 50 years in the feminist movement, and has the portrayal remained based on the tropes of the sexy warrior, or have feminist movements changed that representation of medieval women?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I would say from what I have watched and read, because maybe I have a different perspective than Tom. I'm not so much into the sci-fi and high fantasy books. So I'm maybe the opposite of you, where comics are more accessible and the literature is the bite that's a little bit big for me to bite off. But I would say that it's moved away a little bit from the sexy warrior woman, in that it's not just a stand-in there. You're not there to just stand beside the man. You have a more active role on the screen. So, for example, in Vikings, Lagertha, it goes throughout most of the series, and she plays an active role. And while of course, you're going to have, in popular culture, you still want a pleasant-looking character. That's something that hasn't changed, but she plays a more active role in the plot. Throughout the series, you have other characters who are the same type of character, like Thorin or other ones, who get killed off and don't play a whole role through the whole series, but there's more of a visual accent. So you see more women on screen, I would say. And then on that too, with the Thor comics itself, having a female incarnation of Thor is an interesting shift of dynamic too. You have, Jane actually is the Thor character. So I hope I answered that a little bit for you.
Yeah, I think I'm not familiar with Norsemen, but I've definitely watched the first couple of seasons of the Viking television show. And you do see quite a broad representation of female characters and types within that show, right? From, as you pointed out in your talk, the character of Sikki, who sort of gains her power through different methods than Lagertha or some of the others. But I think there's also, if I recall correctly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Thorun does have a rather dim view of the traditional female role, and she's really only concerned with being a woman warrior or a warrior woman, as it were.
Yeah.
And then I wonder, how do you see? And I'm going to admit that I can't remember that, but the woman that Ragnar leaves Lagertha for,
Auslag?
Auslag, exactly. How do you see her character in the context of that show?
Yeah, she's interesting because she has a few more. The show gives her a few more tools to draw on. There, she uses more. She has a legendary background. She's the daughter of, I can't remember if she's the daughter of Odin or whatnot, but she has authority in her position as a royal person. She doesn't have to use violence to get her purpose done, right? So she has more tools to draw on than just using violence, whereas that's something we see maybe with Lagertha's character. She uses more violence to solve things.
Right. I see that Heather also has a question for you. So Heather, if you want to go ahead and ask.
Thanks. Meghan, you mentioned, but you said you didn't want to go into it very much, the question of the female warrior supposedly excavated in Birka, 581, is it? I went to a talk that Neil Price, who was one of the authors of the article, gave, and one of his colleagues as well. And they said that after they published this theory that it was a female grave, they were getting upwards of 500 abusive texts a week. Who do you think was so kind of infuriated by the suggestion, and why do you think they were?
Yeah, I attended one of his talks on that as well. So there was an interesting backlash against having the possibility that it was a female. So I don't know if I can answer who it was, but maybe some of the backlash comes from, it's something that people aren't familiar with and that they don't feel comfortable with. If, it's a big part of our culture of the patriarchy and being uncomfortable with women in positions of power, especially considering the interpretation of it as a female military commander, not just a warrior, as someone who's actually like a top echelon. So I think people are uncomfortable with that, which is an interesting dialogue. And there was a huge backlash, and it kind of fueled this viral, as we use Tom's term, a viral thing made it all over the internet about how people were so upset about it. And I think that's really interesting, and it has lots to say about our culture.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, but I couldn't begin to explain it. So strange.
Yeah.
Thanks, Meghan, and thanks for a great paper.
Thank you. Yeah, I see the question from Dustin. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah.
You can go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to read out that question, or Dustin, if you wanted to give that question verbally, just in case anyone doesn't have access to the chat, if you wanted to just read it out for us. Oh, I think you're on mute, Dustin.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Yep. Okay, awesome. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, as you were showing all these textiles, and it just, and then you mentioned comic books and graphic novels, it just kind of reminded me, it was almost like, how they tell a story through panels. They have you see the panel of Spider-Man doing something, and then it kind of, it's just, I was just wondering if you think that some of these textiles could actually be sort of like an artistic precursor to comic books in some ways.
Absolutely. I went through the online website, which I don't think I showed the slide with the links, but on the website, called papers here, there is a link to my slides that have the website to the Bayeux Tapestry. But I went through the whole thing, and it was like very much reading a story panel by panel. And absolutely, I kind of think that's a valid point. And in the other examples of the Game of Thrones retelling and the Njal saga, and there's another one that was done in the north that I can't remember which saga it was, but yeah, absolutely, a compartmentalized little parts of the story and following along visually, very much so.
Yeah, that Game of Thrones one with them all getting killed, but the Lannisters send their regards. That was, I was like, what? Oh my God. Yeah, it's such a devastating scene. So yeah.
Caitlin Parsons has just mentioned another series, Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard, and I've actually got the first one here. And there's 3 of them so far, but like I say, 3 of them so far, clearly they come out, well, faster than you can keep up with them. And of course, it's also, I just read it, it's a good thick 500-pager. So there's plenty there. The problem is finding some kind of path through it all. Okay, sorry, that was all. I was just mentioning that I actually got that one already. Yeah.
I have a question for Tom.
Please go ahead, Donald. Yeah.
Tom, have you noticed any relationship between new print editions of Norse literature, or new television series as sources of information about Norse culture, and the production of new fantasy? Is there a relationship? Does a new television series spark a new series of novels, as you've seen? Because there are many.
I wouldn't be surprised if the Vikings TV series didn't actually start to generate responses. I haven't noticed any yet, but there's obviously going to be a bit of a time lag between the TV series and a book coming out. So I think actually at the moment, and as far as I can tell, the probably the most prolific news source are the Marvel comics. I mean, sorry, I don't mean the Marvel comics. I mean the Marvel films based on the Marvel comics. But I don't think they have anything very original in them, so that actually if you get a motif derived from the movie, you can't be sure it is from the movie. But then I'm quite sure that if you got the script writers together and interrogated them on where the hell they got this idea from, they wouldn't know. They wouldn't know. They'd pick it up from each other. I did look at the index once of the Marvel Thor comics, and after skimming through this index for a bit, I thought, they just make it up. They get it from anywhere. A lot of it is actually science fiction. They pick it up from science fiction stories, and then they introduce it into the kind of superhero universe. But actually, disentangling that, as I say, I don't think the authors or the scriptwriters could do it. They don't know either. That's what it means when things go viral. Any other questions we can?
Well, I was sorry. I was just going to jump in and say that we are right at 11:30, which was when we were planning to end this current panel. So I do want to just thank the presenters and everyone for your wonderful comments and questions. So thank you very much. This was extremely interesting. And yeah, I look forward to hearing the rest of the presentations through the rest of our day.
Thanks to everybody for the comments.
Thank you.